we've been talking about holiness, so how God is holy, and then how Jesus is also making us holy as a people, that Jesus, he saved us to be holy, right? We've been saved to be sanctified, justified to be sanctified, saved to be a certain kind of people. And next week, we're gonna close out the series talking about personal holiness and just what does that look like to grow in our holiness, to be holy. But this week, I wanna take a little bit different look at it. I wanna talk about us as a church. What does it mean that the church, together as a community, collectively, what does it mean for us to be set apart to be holy? That we are set apart. God has called for himself a people to be holy. And the Bible's basically gonna say in 1 Peter today that the church is set apart by God to be this distinct, different people, this cultural minority. That we are a people that looks different from the world around us. We're a church that looks different than the culture around us. That by definition, we're never gonna be trendy, we're never gonna be relevant, we're never gonna be cool, because to be holy means to be different. And so we're gonna do things differently, and sometimes people aren't going to like that. In fact, Peter, he's writing this letter to churches in a particular region, and they weren't facing the lions, they weren't facing that kind of persecution, they were being made fun of. It was a persecution of words. They were being mocked, they were being made fun of, they were being reviled. That's the word that he uses. And so he's writing this letter to encourage them to keep going in that, even though they're being mocked for doing things differently. One commentator said that Peter's readers were receiving a barrage of verbal abuse designed to demean, discredit, and shame them as social and moral deviants, endangering the common good. That's the kind of persecution that they were facing. In fact, I'm just curious, like how many of you, because you're a Christian, because of what you believe or even what you say, you've been mocked because you're a Christian? You've been made fun of because you're a Christian? Yeah. So that happens, and sometimes we deserve it because we say silly things, but most of the time it's just because we believe something different from the rest of the world. And especially as we move more into a post-Christian, post-COVID, post-Malone type culture, we're going to look, we're going to look different. Okay, it's going to look a little bit different. Tim Keller, he says this: once in cities, Christians should be a dynamic counterculture. That it is not enough for us to simply live as individuals in the city, we must live as a particular kind of community. Jesus told his disciples they were a city on a hill that showed God's glory to the world. And so Christians are called to be an alternate city within every earthly city, an alternate human culture within every human culture, to show how sex, money, and power can be used in non-destructive ways. We're a church set apart to be holy. We're gonna be different, okay? And so Peter is writing to these churches about what holiness looks like in their culture. He's addressing things that would look different in their culture. He's talking about their holiness being expressed in ways that are appropriate in their particular historic moment. And it's not that holiness changes from culture to culture. It doesn't. I mean, lying is not, holy, whatever culture you might be in. Killing is not okay, no matter what culture you might be in. But what they're recognizing, what the biblical writers recognize, is that whatever culture we do find ourselves in, we're at risk for becoming just like that particular culture. Does that make sense? Like the Christians, churches historically have erred when they try to colonize a people. That's wrong. But then we also err when we are colonized by the people. When we end up looking just like the culture, that's also not okay. We're to be set apart from the world for the world, okay? And so Pastor Peter, he looks at the cultural landscape of his day, and he writes this letter to these churches about what it's gonna look like for them to be different. Hey, you're gonna be tempted here, and you're gonna wanna assimilate in this kind of way. Here's what it means to be God's people in this particular culture at this particular time. And so what I wanna do is I wanna give us the same vision. I want to do the same thing in our cultural moment as the Paradox Church in Fort Worth, Texas, in the US, in 2022, 2023. I want to give us a vision for what it might look like for us to be a church that is holy. And so here's what I want to do. I want to point out a few anchors. I want to grab a hold of a few things in the text that Darian read. And so we have our feet on some hard biblical ground. And then at the end, I want to talk about 4 ways in which I think we are to be holy. So first, in verse 9, it says, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, so that, right, here's the purpose, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Here's what he's saying. He's saying we are set apart from the world. We're to be holy, distinct from the world, for the world. Do you see that? We're to be set apart so that we might proclaim then the excellencies of Christ. He's saying God has made you holy. He's made you different. You're this cultural minority, but you're set apart from the world for the world. You're to proclaim the excellencies of Jesus to the world. Some of you think that you're holy, but you don't love people, which makes you not holy. Some of you think that you're holy and set apart from the world, but you're not set apart from the world for the world. And so you don't love the world, and so you're actually not holy. You like culture wars, you want to win arguments, and you don't want to win people. That's actually not holy. We're to be holy, set apart from the world for the sake of the world. We're not to be jerks for Jesus. That's just historically what I've called it, right? Some of you are just jerks for Jesus. You're like, I'm being different. I'm being, you're just a jerk. That's not the same thing. Holiness is to be set apart from the world for the world. We've got this one dude in our church he loves the church. And he loves the Bible, and he loves Jesus. And we've been having this conversation for a while. I don't know if you were here last week on the topic that we hit on, but he's got his best friend is gay. He's got family members that are gay, and he's got his own sexual stuff that he's working through. And he's just trying to wrestle with all of that. Like, man, how do I honor Jesus? How do I love people? How do I be obedient to the scriptures? And how do I go into the world but be different from the world? I love that. That's what we're to be. We have to wrestle with that a little bit, that we would be set apart from the world, but we would be in the world that might actually have impact on the world. Okay, that's the first thing I wanted us to see. Second thing, in verse 10. In verse 10, he says, once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you have not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. He's quoting the prophet Hosea here, which is an amazing story it's just an amazing story of God's love for the church. But he's quoting them, and this is what keeps us humble in our pursuit of holiness. We're to remember who we were before we met Jesus. Now we're to remember who we are in Christ, that there's no way, we have been made holy already. We talked about that a couple weeks. We have already been made holy, and so we're to walk out in that, but we're also to remember who we were. What we are saved out of. That keeps us humble in our pursuit of holiness. In 1 Peter chapter 4, a couple of chapters from now, I'll show it to you. He says this is what we were, right? This is what we walked in. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do. Living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. That's a legit list of sins, amen? Right, that's serious there. That's not a TCU list, that's a Texas Tech list of sins. Right, there's some stuff going on there, okay? Yeah. With respect to this, they are surprised when you don't join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. See, what he's saying is, hey, you used to do that. You used to be that, but Jesus saved you out of that. So remember where you came from. Remember what you've been saved from. You needed Jesus too. And so the people that are around you that you're to be different from, they need Jesus. They need grace as well. We're to be super humble about this. In verse 11, he says, beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. He's encouraging them in this because they still fall into that stuff. Just like us, Peter's readers, Peter's church, they fall into the same kind of things. We don't drift into holiness. You won't accidentally just kind of float into holiness, right? We drift back to the sins that we once walked in. When he's talking about passions there in verse 11, he's not saying like we can't be passionate. We should absolutely be passionate. He's talking about inordinate loves, disordered loves, Augustine called it. where we love things more than we love God. We love things more than we love Jesus. When you love things more than you love Jesus, you can still come to church on a Sunday and lift your hands and worship, but you walk not in holiness, but in unholiness because you love some stuff more than him. And so he's saying, man, be humble. Like you've come from some stuff. He saved you out of some stuff. You still walk into some of that stuff. You need Jesus as much as the people around you need Jesus. And so we are to be humble and holy. Right? Humble and holy. Third thing, in verse 4 and 5, he says, as you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Notice that our holiness only comes through Christ. We are only holy through Christ. We come to him, this living stone. He's the one that builds us up. We are offering spiritual sacrifices that are only acceptable because it's through Jesus. He's saying Jesus is everything in all of this. We're nothing. We ourselves apart from him are not holy. We ourselves apart from him have nothing to offer. That it is only through Jesus that we have been made this church, that we have been made holy, that he is everything. The verse right before that, in verse 3, it says, hey, crave spiritual milk. And in context there, he means want more of Jesus, need more of Jesus. Go to Jesus if you've tasted and seen that the Lord is good. That if you're not absolutely enamored with Jesus, none of this stuff is gonna matter. Either, if you're not enamored with Jesus, either you won't desire to be holy at all, so you just become just like the world, or you end up as a jerk for Jesus, right? You end up kind of that piety, that kind of moral piety where you know what's right and everybody else is wrong, but it's not through Jesus that you do things, it's through your legalistic endeavor. He's saying, no, Jesus is everything. I just was reminded of this in a really sweet way this past week. My mentor and friend over the years, probably been most impactful to me as a leader and a pastor, my friend Elliot. He came into town and we had the whole staff, and we had all of our daughter churches, so Pillar and Grace and Redemption, all of them came with their staff. It was like 50 of us in a room, and he just spent the morning walking us through Jesus' love for us. It was awesome. It was like just a bunch of pastors and church planners and deacons and ministry leaders, just having somebody pour into us the love of Jesus and how he's a friend to us and how he loves us and how he was betrayed like we can be betrayed, and he suffered like we can suffer. And so he would do like these different teachings, and then we would have to kind of, do an exercise or write a prayer or something. And just after one of them, I went into my office, and I'm supposed to be writing something, but I would go to my office and just wept at my chair. Just overwhelmed at how good of a friend Jesus has been to me. That he's faithful. And I think what made me emotional was just the idea that, like, I've been tired lately. I've been cranky. I don't know if any of you ever get that way, just working too much. And I know that's surprising because I seem very, happy all the time and normal. I just was cranky. And what struck me was that he is faithful and he loves me despite me. That's holiness. Like, I can be holy to people that I like. I can be holy to people that are being good to me. What about being holy? What about walking in holy? What about loving people that reject you, that betray you, that ignore you? That's holiness, right? That you need the Holy Spirit for that kind of holiness. And so what he's saying is, like, we need Jesus to really be holy. It's Jesus that makes us holy. It's Jesus that is helping us to be holy. We are nothing apart from Jesus, nothing. Okay, last thing. Notice in verse 5, he's using these images to describe the church. In verse 5 and verse 9, he says we are a spiritual house, a temple, that we're a holy priesthood, that we're all priests working in that temple, that everything we touch is sacred now. And then in verse 9, we're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, and a holy nation. That Peter, he's going out of his way to paint these different pictures to describe us as a holy people. doing holy things. That we're a holy people doing holy things, that we're to be set apart. We're supposed to be this little slice of heaven on earth, this kind of little slice of heaven as the local church in the city. We're a city on a hill, a counterculture, this cultural minority as a holy people, okay? That's what I want to talk about. What does that look like for us to be a spiritual house, a royal priesthood, a holy nation? What does it look like for us to be a chosen race? What does that look like for us to be that in Fort Worth? There's a surviving letter from the 2nd century that it describes the church in the early church in how it lived out this kind of stuff. And it's fascinating to read it because it's this like beautiful paradox, if you will. It's one of the reasons why we named the church the Paradox, was this letter of what the church can look like in a particular culture. And it's long, but it's worth it, okay? So let me read it to you. This is an early church letter. For the Christians are distinguished from other men, not by country or language, or the customs which they observe, for they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a peculiar form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity. But inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, according as the lot of each of them has determined, following the customs of the natives in respect to clothing and food and the rest of their ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and striking method of life. As citizens, they share everything with others and yet endure all things as if strangers. Listen to this. They marry as do all others. They beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the desires of the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men and yet are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. They lack all things and yet abound in all. They are dishonored and yet in their very dishonor they are glorified. They are evil spoken of and yet are justified. They are reviled and yet they bless. They are insulted but repay the insult with honor. They do good yet are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice as if quickened into life. They are assailed by the Jews as foreigners. They are persecuted by the Greeks, yet those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. Like, I want to be on that team. That's the kind of church I want to be a part of. I mean, that's like legit, that's holiness. That's what Jesus has made us. That's what a spirit-filled, gospel-formed people look like. That's what I mean by holiness. It's bold, it's strong, it's fierce, it's risk-taking, it's kind, it's generous, it's humble, it's different. That's what it means to be a church, holy, set apart. And if we can figure that out, if by the power of the Spirit, we can figure out how to be different without being too weird, bold without being a jerk, humble without being a coward, now we're talking. That's what I want us to be. So, what does that look like? What does that look like to be the Paradox Church in Fort Worth, in Texas, in the United States in 2022? 1, a church that is set apart as holy will cultivate holy habits of resistance. This may seem surprising to you that this is the first thing and that's even on this list, but I actually don't think we're gonna be able to do all the other things unless we do this thing first. Let me read it again. A church that is set apart as holy will cultivate holy habits of resistance. Every culture has its rhythms, its way of doing things. So Norway, for example, they are the second most productive nation in the world, but the average employee in Norway only works 27 hours a week. They have a way of doing things, a culture, and it produces what it produces. If the church is a holy nation, then we need our own way of doing things. We have to have counter habits of resistance that transform us by the renewal of our minds instead of us being conformed into a pattern of the way in which the rest of the world does things. Earlier in the chapter, up in verse 2, he says, long for pure spiritual milk. That word long for is crave. Crave pure spiritual milk, that by it we would grow, we would mature, okay? And so that's a call to spiritual rhythms and practices. That's a call to a communion with God, that for us to grow, for us to be holy, we actually have to get with God, we have to have communion with God and spend time with God through the regular rhythms and practices that Christians have always done. Reading their Bible, pray, Sabbath, silence and solitude, fasting, all of that. And we've talked about this for years. If you've been around the Paradox, this is like one of our things. We talk about the spiritual disciplines all the time. But we have to recognize that this is important because what we've said like all along is the ways in which we live in the world now is forming us, is discipling us more than an hour on a Sunday is going to disciple you. That our phones are discipling us. Social media is forming us. And that when we spend so much of our time in those things and we don't spend very much time with the Lord, what are we being discipled by? Those things. Study after study has shown that too much time on our phones has profound impacts on our physical health. It affects our stress, our anxiety, it affects our sleeplessness, our restlessness, even stress-induced shallow breathing patterns. The phone does that. The phones change the way we engage relationally. If you've read Sherry Turkle's groundbreaking work on this, she's an MIT sociologist, and like even the phone on the table as we talk affects the depth of our conversation and the intimacy that we feel in that moment. Our engagement with technology affects us socially and politically. We're algorithms, they curate content for us. We're not even seeing the world, we're not even experiencing the world in the same way. How can we possibly be a community if we do that? And so the point of all of this is that if we just watch shows on Netflix, scroll for hours a week on social media, go down the rabbit holes of YouTube, they don't just waste time, they're actually discipling us and forming us into a particular kind of community. We're being discipled by that, and we want to be discipled by Jesus instead. So how do you do that? You cultivate habits of resistance, rhythms in your life, where you do things a little bit different so that your soul can chill for a second and quiet your heart for a moment so you can actually hear from God. Let me just speak this plainly. I don't think we can be set apart holy unless we do our calendars, our phones, our social media, our habits and rhythms vastly different than the culture around us. Vastly different. We are anxious and awkward and apathetic as a culture, in part because of how we interact with the world and what we do all the time. And if we crave spiritual milk, we'll want more of Jesus, and then our rhythms will have to change. We need to develop a written down rhythm of life. I think we literally should write down what are the counter habits of my life. I don't care what they are. This is not like a legalistic, you have to do this, this, and this. I'm just saying write them down. I'm gonna read the Paradox 365 reading plan in the morning. I'm going to turn my phone off for an hour a day at between 5 and 6. I'm gonna take a 24-hour Sabbath every week. Here are the rhythms that I'm gonna put into my life because I don't drift into holiness. And so I wanna crave pure spiritual milk. I wanna run to Jesus. I cannot be holy on my own. And so I wanna frame my life in a way that pursues Jesus. You have no idea how much I want this fruit. Like I don't know that we can be all that we are meant to be as a people and as a church without this. Like you look at Jesus's life, and I love Jesus so much. He's just so chill. And he's always ready for the moment, and he's always got the right thing to say, and he's engaging with love, and he speaks truth. Why? It's because he's gotten away with the Father. Right, over and over again, he withdraws to a desolate place and he gets with the Father and he's shaped by the Father and he's loved by the Father and he's formed. And so when he steps into that moment, he's got this, what one author says, this non-anxious persona in the midst of the chaos. He's just ready. Why? Because he got away with the Father. I want us to be ready. How do we do that? We get away with Jesus. Where we're formed by Jesus, not by the world. Second, a church that is set apart as holy will fight for holy justice. We will fight for holy justice. If as the church we are, as Peter says, set apart as a holy nation, we should operate by holy laws of justice. And I don't mean actual laws necessarily, though we should certainly vote for and advocate for righteous laws in our particular nation. But I'm talking more about the way we operate as the church, as a holy nation. In verse 12, it says that we are to do good deeds, that we're called to honorable conduct. We're a holy priesthood. Part of the priesthood ministry was to mediate justice. We are to fight as God's people for a holy justice. Now, there's a number of issues we could talk about in regards to justice. I'll give you three. Maybe I think they're the most important. I don't know. There's a number of justice issues we could talk about, but let me just give you three that stand out to me the most. If we're a church that fights for holy justice, then we'll be a church that fights against sex trafficking. I don't think we realize quite enough that pornography is not just a moral issue, it's a justice issue. I don't know that if you haven't done the research, if you haven't done the reading, if you don't know what pornography does in regards to sex trafficking, you might be surprised. As one doctor said, I have not found one case of violent sex crimes in over 10 years of practice as a psychotherapist that do not involve pornography. If you go to places like ExodusCry.com or just other organizations like that and educate yourself, you'll realize that you're not watching willing participants on a screen. You are helping to fund sex trafficking with every click. And the problem is that it's great. Like, the vision for us has to be greater than we're just not going to be a church that looks at pornography, because we're called to much more than that. But we have to start there because we're doing that. So we have to start there, but then we've got to fight. We haven't done nothing yet. We just got to stop clicking, and then we've got to fight. And then we've got to get after what's actually happening in all of that. We are created to do more than that. The porn industry is oppressive and abusive. It's a sex slave trade. And so what do? We go to the Mace breakfast on November 17th, Men Against Sexual Exploitation. We serve at the net. If we're a woman in this church, we go serve at the net, and we visit the women in jail that are caught up in sex trafficking and prostitution. If you got money, you should be funding these kinds of things and giving money to these kinds of things. We as a church give lots of money to these kinds of things. If you're an artist, you should write songs about it and paint paintings about this. Like, you realize this is a justice issue. Back in, I thought this was super interesting. Back in 1861, during the slavery and all of that in America, there was a woman named Julia Ward Howe. And she was a published poet, and she visits Washington, D.C. with her husband, and they observe the Union Army, okay? I know we're in the South. The Union Army, that one, then the Union Army, and they're singing this kind of popular song, okay? It's a marching song. It was well known at the time. It was called John Brown's Body. It was after a famous abolitionist, John Brown. And so a preacher standing next to her while they're kind of listening to this song, he encourages her to rewrite the lyrics, and so she does, right? So she does. And she writes the lyrics, and she sells them to a well-known magazine. They call it the Battle Hymn of the Republic, with its famous chorus, glory, glory, hallelujah, his truth is marching on. And so the new song, it spreads through the Union armies, and it becomes this it goes viral, right? And it's this anti-slavery abolitionist anthem, and here are the last lines of the song. Listen to them. As he, Jesus, died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on. Why aren't we writing songs like that about justice issues, about things that we as the church are to be fighting for? Why aren't we singing those things and reading those things and looking at paintings of those things and giving money to that kind of stuff? We have to stop our own viewing of pornography, and then we've got to get to work. There's work to be done because this is a justice issue. Second thing, racial reconciliation. In verse 9, he calls the church a chosen race. The word there in the Greek for race, it's the word genos, and it refers to a people that come from a common lineage. And so what he's saying is that the church, the local church even, our common ancestry is not our color or our culture. It's certainly not our political affiliation, but that our common ancestry is that we are born again with God as our Father through Jesus Christ the Son as our big brother. right? That we're a family, we're this new race, this new man, this new people. And so it's beautiful because he's saying we are, by definition, as a church, a diverse family, which was a radical idea back then, and it still is for us today. That the majority of Muslims are from countries in the Middle East, the majority of Hindus are from India, the majority of Buddhists are in Asia, but Christians right now are almost equally split across the globe in North America, South America, Europe, and Africa. Right, that we are made a diverse people. And so the culture has its diversity. The culture can even have its unity in the diversity around some things, but only the gospel-formed people of God can bring about reconciliation. That we have a ministry of reconciliation, that it's only Jesus that can reconcile what's broken between races and cultures. Ephesians 2, it talks about Jesus not just reconciling us to God, but to one another. That specifically on the cross, Ephesians 2 says Jesus broke down the dividing wall of hostility that had separated us, and he makes one new man in place of the many. That we're one new race, one new man in place of the many. And so Jesus, he already broke down the wall. Our job is to not build it back up. Our job is to fight to continue to reconcile what Jesus has made possible in his work on the cross. And so when your family member says CRT this and CRT that, and when your friend says black this, white that, brown that, you preach Christ. He's already broken that wall down. Critical race theory, it might identify historic problems, but only Jesus is the answer. And there are problems. And it would be really silly to be a people that doesn't think that there's still problems. Civil rights movement was just a generation ago. You don't think there's still a residue of broken, fractured relationships between our races? So we have to fight for that. By definition, the Church of Jesus is a diverse church, reconciled to God, reconciled to one another. We've been given the ministry of reconciliation. We alone have the ability to reconcile races. We worship together, we eat together, we have the gospel of Jesus together, we share the table together. We all say we need the grace of God together. Thirdly, we fight for justice, holy justice, by fighting for vulnerable women and children. I thought it was funny because I came into this week wondering, I wonder if this is going to be more controversial than even last week's. It's possible that it will be. I want to be really crystal clear here. And no one can actually argue this, the statement I'm about to make. Nobody will actually argue with this. Not one scientist, not one doctor would argue this. That abortion is killing an innocent life. Not one doctor, not one scientist would disagree with that statement. That abortion is killing an innocent life. And we might call it different things. We might say terminating a pregnancy. We might say we are aborting a fetus, but everyone agrees what that means absolutely, what that actually means. Now, it used to be a different debate. Roe v. Wade it happened back in 1973, and at the time, the sonogram, it was just getting started in England. It wasn't really even used here in America until the mid to late 70s. And so the debate back then was about science. It was a scientific debate. It was, is there life in the womb? When does life happen in the womb? That's not even a question. That's not even a debate anymore. We don't talk about that at all because the science has advanced so much that we just know. Now, then the debate became over personhood. It was when does a life become a person? When does this life form become a person? And it's this classic debate, and I say classic because we've used it before. We've actually used that debate over when is life a person before. Listen to these laws. In 1858, in the Virginia Supreme Court, it says this: in the eyes of the law, the slave is not a person. In 1881, in the American Law Review, it says an American Indian, is not a person within the meaning of the Constitution. In 1928, at the Supreme Court of Canada, it is Canada, but it says the meaning of qualified persons does not include women. In 1936, in the German Supreme Court, it says the Reich itself refused to recognize Jews as persons in the legal sense. Roe v. Wade, Justice Blackmun, who wrote the court's opinion, said, quote, that the word person, as used in the 14th Amendment, does not include the unborn. We've done this before. This is how delusional that is, that black slaves, American Indians, women, and Jews were all at some point legally not persons with rights. This is a civil rights issue. This is a civil rights issue. Southern churches during the civil rights movement, they were largely silent around civil rights issues, around the oppression of African Americans in America at that time. And so Martin Luther King Jr. writes this famous letter, the letter from Birmingham jail. And he says to the mainly Southern white churches, he said, "I've watched white churches stand on the sidelines and merely mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. And I fear that that's what we're doing on the topic of abortion. Some of you say, and rightly so, that there are vulnerable women among us, that don't have any other options, and that's why they choose that option. Agreed, 100%. What are you doing about it? Because we're doing a lot as a church. Maybe you don't know this, right? We're doing so. We have Embrace Grace groups that rally around the pregnant women that are disenfranchised. Right now in our office are like 40 Amazon boxes filled with stuff so we can throw them baby showers. What are you gonna do about it? I agree that they're there. I agree that we need to do something about the women that are looking for abortion as an option. I absolutely agree. There are like deadbeat dad laws that need to be enforced. There are things that we can do to legislate, to fight for, to fund. We have to do those things. We've got 7 or 8 foster kids in our church right now. What if that was 70 or 80? In the 11 years of our church, we've literally given hundreds of thousands of dollars for adoptions, pregnancy centers, and caring for single moms. Do not tell me that we only care about life in the womb. By the way, we have not stopped those ministries since abortion became illegal in Texas. The work is still happening. We still have work to do. And if you are one of those that was just legislate, pro-life policies, and you aren't taking out your checkbook, doing something about it, that's hypocritical. No, we're gonna do both. We're gonna keep fighting. This is a justice issue. This is a justice issue. And a church that is set apart as holy will fight for the holy justice of the world, even if it's unpopular. 3, a church that is set apart as holy will practice a holy sex ethic. We talked about this last week a lot, and so I won't say as much here, but the biblical way of marriage, sex, and singleness is just vastly different than our current context. It just is. That if we are to be obedient to the scriptures, we will absolutely look different than the rest of the world in regards to sex, marriage, and singleness. The biblical view is that sex is a great gift from God that is to happen in marriage between one man and one woman. That sex outside of marriage is always transactional, so it will never be intimate. You will never find intimacy outside of marriage. It is never actually fully, really consensual until you're in marriage, because it's only in marriage that you give your whole lives to one another, not just your bodies. The way in which God has designed this is wonderful and beautiful, and it's a gift. And the way in which the world is doing it isn't working. People are you have to read the numbers. I'm trying to figure out how to say this in a way that isn't too crude. People are choosing pornography and themselves rather than an actual partner. That our world right now, current culture, is having less sex than it ever has before. That's terrible. It's a great gift. It's really good. You should get married and As well, the biblical view of singleness acknowledges that sex and marriage isn't everything. That we worship Jesus, who was single, never had sex, and lived the most fulfilled, happy life. Tim Keller, he says, the church needs to create a sexual counterculture that is lived out in community, where we become a place where men and women refrain from sex before marriage, where men and women seek a marriage partner not on the basis of looks and wealth, but character. That the unmarried, whether divorced, widowed, or never married, are incorporated as extended family members, having close friendships of both sexes and nurturing relationships with children. What a great bullet point that is. 4, people with same-sex attraction are valued members and are given support for their calling to chastity. And 5, people who have struggled with issues of sex and gender are welcomed and listened to with humility, patience, and love. Gosh, man, like it's so hard. It's such a weird, as soon as you say the first thing, everybody thinks you don't mean the last thing. I want to be all the things. We should be all the things. Lastly, a church that is set apart as holy will inculturate holy honor. This one's not as sexy as the other ones. By sexy, I just mean interesting. But kind of like the first one, I don't know that any of this works if we don't do this one. That we're gonna build into our culture, in fact, it's one of our cultural values, holy honor. Remember, Peter, he's writing to a people and he's saying, here's what holiness would look like expressed in your historic moment. I think our historic moment, our cultural moment is the same need. One of his big themes in the letter is honor. In chapter 1, he says our faith will be honored at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Here in a few verses, he'll say honor everyone, even honor the emperor. In chapter 3, he says to husbands, honor your wives. By the way, that was revolutionary in that day with the class system that they had in regards to gender. And I don't have to convince you that our current cultural moment is not honorable. It is not, we do not speak with honor. It's tearing down, not building up. That's the norm, right? That what is normal is that we cancel, not forgive. What is normal is that we retaliate, not turn the other cheek. And so imagine a church where we outdo one another in showing honor. Ray Ortlund, he says this, he says, we who are destined for glory are now commanded by God to create alternative cultures of honor called churches, where people are lifted up, their accomplishments celebrated, their strengths admired, their weaknesses forgiven. This new relational environment has high standards in keeping with the glory of the gospel itself. Faithfulness to the gospel requires more of us than an adherence to a doctrinal statement. It also requires of us a whole new way to treat one another, a way marked by glory and honor. Who couldn't flourish there? Like, who couldn't thrive in a church like that, where you're honored? Like, what if we were generous with our words? What would it be like if somebody came into our midst and they breathed this air of honor and they were built up instead of torn down? What if we were promiscuous with our words, not our bodies? What if we were generous with one another? Like, what if we took seriously the reality that all people are made in the image of God and we spoke to them and about them as such? What if it wasn't okay to badmouth Beto or Governor Abbott at our dinner tables this week, but instead we honored the emperor? What does it look like to be a culture of honor? Let me close with this. In chapter 3, verse 13, he says, now who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, even if you should suffer for being holy, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy. When it comes down to it, we are holy for the world, but we're also holy for Jesus. Jesus, he says that he loves his church, and he's washing us with the water of his grace that we might be holy and blameless. We honor Christ when we're obedient to his word. And in the end, what we're gonna find is that there's more joy for us, that we're actually taking part in the world in the way in which we want to, in the way in which we should. But what if we just started there? I love Jesus, and I want to spend time with Jesus. I want to be obedient to Jesus. Jesus, who has made me holy and who is making me holy. Listen, friends, what's gonna, and this is what we'll cover next week, but what in the end is going to make us a church that is holy is that we we fall more in love with Jesus. The grace of God, the love of God, friendship with God. And we start following him and doing what he does, and these kind of things, they start to become a little bit more normal, and we don't drift away from holiness. We begin to follow Christ into holiness. This is a huge call. This is a huge vision. And we're gonna need the Spirit to do it. We're gonna need Jesus to do it. We're gonna need grace to do it. We're gonna need to build one another up and encourage one another to do it. But this is the church set apart as holy.